Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Yu Shimizu. I'm a professor of psychology and also the faculty research coordinator at ARC. And today it is my honor to introduce Dr. Jason Chan, a professor of psychology at Iowa State University. Dr. Chan's research focuses on improving memory performance in both educational and legal contexts. His research has received over 3,000 citations, and he's published in many of the top journals in his field, including Psychological Bulletin, Journal of Experimental Psychology General, Psychological Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. His research is supported by the National Science Foundation. The title of his talk is Changing the Future of Online Education with Retrieval Practice, where he'll be describing research on online learning featuring community college students, including ARC students.
Oh, awesome.
So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Jason Chan.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I want to express my deep gratitude for being able to come here to give this talk and being able to collaborate with community colleges like ARC. As it will become apparent later in the talk, a lot of the research in psychology or in educational psychology are done with basically convenient sampling of university students. And the topic of my talk is about online learning, and as you all know, better than I do by a lot, that community colleges are basically at the forefront of online education, but students from community colleges are grossly underrepresented in research, especially in psychology research. So I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to be able to test students here and collect data here, and along with a few other community colleges, which I'll talk about in basically the second half of my talk. But I want to start by giving you a brief introduction about my research interests. I'm a memory researcher, and I do research on a lot of things related to memory, especially with scenarios where memory plays an important role, such as education, such as legal situations like eyewitness memory, false memory, that kind of stuff. And in the last 10 or so years of my research, I've been focusing a lot on trying to understand how retrieving information from memory can change how a person learns information. So retrieving information from memory is something that we do all the time. We do it when we explicitly ask students to recall information for a test, for example, for take an exam, or they're studying for an exam. They're constantly retrieving information. It turns out retrieval has a very powerful effect on memory itself. More than just if you ask them to retrieve something and you're assessing whether they know something or not. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the rest of the talk. So for the talk today, I want to focus on education. And as we have seen in the last few years, there's really an explosion of moving from traditional sort of brick-and-mortar university teaching to online teaching and online learning. And one of the issues that we, as educators, have to grapple with is how to deal with students' learning outcomes in online education. There's been studies after studies looking at learning outcomes comparing online education to in-person education. And time again, these studies tend to show that students who take online courses tend to perform a little bit more poorly than students who take the equivalent course in person. So you see this type of data regardless of what outcome measures you use. It could be dropout rate, it could be failing rate, it could be achievement gap between black and white students. It widens the achievement gap between white and black students in online courses compared to in-person courses. And of course, when students take courses online, they tend to be doing other things while they're at home or where they're at Starbucks or whatever it is. They're doing other things, whereas if the students is taking class in person, listening to a lecture, the worst they could do tend to be falling asleep, maybe occasionally doing some online shopping. But there are other people around them, right? There are other people around them who can see what they're doing, and it serves as a deterrent for them to do other things. So in-person education sort of is a gold standard in how we want to teach students, but the world is moving in a way that online education is just only going to become more and more important, more and more widespread. And of course, online education has the benefit of, we can reach so many more people in online education compared to brick and mortar universities. So how do we deal with the issues when it comes to learning outcomes, poorer learning outcomes compared to in-person education? And it turns out one of the things that I do research on, which is that retrieval, memory retrieval practice that sometimes we talk about, is a good way to enhance learning. And one thing that people have, traditionally people think about memory retrieval as in terms of education is giving people tests. Right? If you want them to retrieve information, you give them a test. And tests for a long time has been thought about as an assessment. And of course it is an assessment. If you want to know how much students have learned something, you give them a test. Without the test, there's no way for us to know how much students have learned, right? Or you can give homeworks, you can give assignments, but tests is typically how we assess students' learning, and it remains to this day the standard by which we judge students' learning and knowledge. But test is more than just an assessment. It is also an intervention. The psychologist Robert Bjork at UCLA have been talking about tests as a memory modifier for a long time. Since the 70s, he's been sort of pushing this idea that testing is more than just assessment. It's also something that changes memory. And it's important to think about it this way, that a lot of times when you assess something, when you measure something, it does not change the underlying constructs for which you're measuring. So if for example, if I stand in front of a ruler and I want to measure how tall I am, and I measure and I found that on a good day, I am 5'3½". Okay? And I could stand in front of that ruler time and time and time again. I will get the same measurement every single time. The assessment in this case does not change the underlying constructs for which I'm measuring. But thinking about tests as an assessment is providing an incomplete picture of what a test does, because taking a test changes the underlying memory. When people retrieve information, it changes the memory, enhances it, okay? And it makes that information much easier to retrieve in the future. So it's a flawed concept to think of tests as just an assessment. It's more than that. It's an intervention. We can use it to help people retrieve information in the future. And so a lot of the research studies, a lot of data that comes out of in the last 15 or so years, it coincided with the rise of popularity in research on testing, sometimes called the testing effect or retrieval practice effect. A lot of research started on this in the mid-2000s, and this paper by Roediger and Karpicki in 2006 is sort of the flashpoint of popularity for research on the testing effect. And after this paper was published, there's been dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of studies that have been published on the phenomenon. And my research my research interest in this also coincided with that time period when I was, the last year in my graduate school was 2006. And I was in the labs that were doing these type of research, so I was one of the people who helped push this movement forward, so to speak. And the retrieval practice paradigm, and you see something that resembles this slide throughout the rest of the talk, involves asking students to study something. And so in this particular experiment, students read an essay about the formation of tree rings and how tree rings are formed and how you can use tree rings to estimate how old the tree is and all that kind of stuff. And the subjects were given 10 or so minutes to read this passage. After they have finished reading it, their time expired, students were split into two groups, randomly assigned, into either a restudy group or a practice test group. In the restudy group, subjects were given another 10 minutes, and they're told, reread this passage and try to study it and memorize it as well as you can. Just like you did for the first 10 minutes, but do it again. Okay? And then the other group were given a blank sheet of paper. The people in the practice test group were given a blank sheet of paper, and they're told, write down as much as you can remember from what you just read in the last 10 minutes. Okay? And so they could recall as much as they can, and for most people in this type of situation, they could probably recall about 30 to 40% of the material that they had studied just now. And so compared to the restudy group, who get to reread the entire passage. Okay? These people get re-exposed to 100% of the information that they studied previously. These people only get re-exposed to the information that they could recall, which is about 30, 40, 50% of the information. Okay? So this group is actually at a disadvantage in the sense that they only get re-exposed to about half of the information that they have studied earlier. This group, however, get to be re-exposed to everything, 100% of the information. And then after a delay, all the subjects took a final test. And this final test, again, is just like this initial test. All the subjects were given a blank sheet of paper, and they're told to recall as much as they can remember. Okay? So everybody's with me so far, everything's clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and then the researchers also manipulated the amount of delay, okay, between this restudy period or practice test period and the final test. And 1/3 of the subjects took the final test 5 minutes later, 1/3 took it 2 days later, and then 1/3 took it 7 days later. The objective is to measure both immediate memory retention and long-term delayed memory retention. So what they found, when people took the final test 5 minutes later, there was basically no difference in performance between people who took the practice test and people who restudied the information. Okay. But after 2 days, that pattern flipped. Now people who took that initial test of free recall on a sheet of blank paper now remember a lot more than the people who restudy. This is called the testing effect. This benefit in performance between having taken practice test and restudy is about 15%. That's actually a pretty big effect. And then 7 days later, the same pattern emerged again. So if you take a look at only the yellow bars, okay, imagine drawing a line across the 3 yellow bars, you can see how fast people forget the information that they have restudied. So immediately, or 5 minutes after they restudied information, they can recall 80% of that information. But 2 days later, they have already forgotten close to half. And then by 7 days later, they could only recall 45% of that information. So this precipitous level of forgetting is very common when people just study things, when they just read. But if you have taken a test, if you take a look here, look at how slow that forgetting is. It went from 75% to 65%, 10% drop in 7 days. It's actually a remarkable level of slowing of forgetting. Okay. So our goal to teach students is for them to be able to retain the information in the long run, then we should encourage them to take practice tests. They could do this by forming study groups. They could do this by using flashcards. There are many different ways to do this, but the key is to retrieve information instead of reread information. Now, if people do use this technique when trying to study information, let's say there's an exam tomorrow, they're studying for it, they're reading the passage, and then they think, I need to retrieve the information, I need to test myself. Students are not going to test themselves on everything. There's just not enough time for them to do it. Maybe they lack the motivation to do it, right? So most students, when they study for an exam, they try to guess what concepts are going to be tested on the exam, and they practice on those. Okay? But what if they guess wrong, right? If I test myself on concept A, the concept A is not on the exam, concept B is on the exam, what happens with that non-test system? Okay? So if I practice concept A, does taking a test or does practicing retrieval on concept A affect my memory for the things that were not tested? Okay? That's the question that I was interested in at the time I started this research. So let's say you're taking an environmental science class and you learned that the increase in concentration of CO2 is the primary contributor to the warming globe, right? And you learn that, and then there's another concept you learn that's related to it. Let's say you learn that burning fossil fuels tends to be a major contributor to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. You learn these two related facts, and you're studying for the exam, and you practice tests on one of them, but not the other. Okay? Let's say you took a practice test on this one about CO2 being the main contributor to the warming Earth, but you don't practice test on this one. Compared to a person who didn't take a practice test on either of the concepts, what will your memory performance be for this concept, the concept for which neither person have taken a practice test on? Okay. So that's the question I wanted to answer is, what does doing some practice tests on a portion of the things you need to learn, how does that affect your memory for the other things? Does it affect your memory for the other things? So what I did was, I did this study, and participants study a variety of topics. They're randomly assigned to one of 4 topics. They either learn something about the history of Hong Kong, the Big Bang Theory, the scientific concept, not the TV show. Nothing against the TV show, it's fun. And the Shaolin Temple, and some other concept, I don't remember what it was 20 years ago. I needed to practice test more. So they studied this. They were given 20 minutes to read the passage. It was about 2,000 words. They were told to use the entire time. And then for some participants, for half the participants who are randomly assigned to this condition, they take a practice test on 18 questions. Okay? They answer specific questions. There are fill-in-the-blanks questions. They answer 18 questions. And that covers about half of the passage that they had read. And then eventually, they took a final test on all of the concepts. Okay? That this final test consists of 36 questions. So double the number of questions that they had been tested on. So it includes both new and old questions. The other group of subjects study the same thing for 20 minutes. And then instead of taking a practice test on half of the information, they don't take a practice test. They do something else. Okay? And then everyone took the final test the same way. And using this design, we were able to split the subjects into basically, or the performance into 3 categories. There are the questions for which that they take a test on, the final test on, that had appeared on the initial test. Okay? These are the questions that they have taken the practice test on, the 18 questions that they had taken the test on immediately after they studied the information. And then a day later, they took that final test, and those questions reappeared. So we would expect that they would do really well on these questions, based on the slide I showed you 5 minutes ago. That will be, these are the questions that reappear. So if they guess correctly that concept A is going to be on the test, and concept A indeed appears on the exam, this will be representative of what the performance will expect from them. And then these are the new concepts, okay? New questions that they did not take a practice test on. How would they do? These are the sort of the concept Bs. Okay? And then this group here, everything on that final test for them are new questions, because they never took the practice test. So everything here is essentially concept B. So the question is, how would they do, okay, on these new questions if they have taken a practice test compared to if they have not? So that's what I'm interested in. So for people who did not take any practice tests, a day later when they came back and they took that final test, and there were 36 questions, their performance was not that great. 42% of the time they answered the questions correctly. Okay. For the people who did take the practice test, for the concepts for which they took a practice test on, they did way better. Okay. This is a huge difference, right? 24% difference is enormous. And then for the new questions, okay, so this is what I'm interested in most, is how they do here. They did better than people who didn't take the practice test on. It's obviously a much smaller effect, a 7% difference on the new questions compared to people who didn't take a practice test at all. Okay? But it is a statistically significant effect. And a 7% difference, I think most students will be pretty happy with. Right? That's a half a letter grade or a third of a letter grade. So what I have found, and colleagues of mine have found time and again, is that retrieval practice can improve memory performance, improves learning, and can improve both memory for the tested materials and also memory for the non-tested material, although to a smaller extent for the non-tested. But then you can think of that as free lunch. So you think about it as free lunch, then 7% is a pretty good free lunch, right? Now, these 2 studies that I've shown you are pretty word I'm looking for. Pretty typical of the type of studies that have been published since the mid-2000s. And there have been hundreds of studies that have looked at this effect of the testing effect. That is that if you retrieve something from memory, okay, you will remember it better. And that's one way to think about it, is that retrieval enhances your memory for things that you have learned in the past. Okay? And this idea is that you learn something, you take a test on it, you retrieve it, now you remember it better. Okay? But what I'm interested in for the last 10 or so years is more about what happens when you retrieve something from the past. Will that affect how you learn something in the future, when you learn something new? And because students, or us, in fact, everybody, right? When we're constantly learning something new. So if you retrieve something that you have learned previously, does that affect how you learn something new in the future? And this is the part of the talk where I talk about changing the future. I know the title of the talk is a little grandiose, changing the future. I'm talking about a very small slice of future, but future nonetheless. Okay? So to figure out how retrieval affects new learning, it's not a difficult thing to do. We just need to take the typical retrieval practice paradigm and add more learning to it. So after students study something, and then if you split them into a practice test group compared to, for example, a no test group or a restudy group, after that, you just give them something new to learn. So changing it to what I would call this interpolated testing paradigm, okay, or interpolated testing design, is that there must be at least 2 different sets of information for them to learn. It could be more than 2 sets of information. It could be 4, it could be 5. Okay? It could be as many as you want. But the idea is that there are multiple sets of information for them to learn, and each set of information is independent of each other. They could be related, they could be unrelated. People have done all kinds of research on this. So the question here then is, if you take a test, okay, on something that you have learned previously, let's say you're taking a Spanish class, introductory Spanish class, and you're learning some basic Spanish words. Let's say you need to learn 20 Spanish words, and you may want to break them down into 2 sets. The first set may contain things like uno is 1, dos is 2, tres is 3, so on and so on. And then the other set could be que is what, okay? Cuando is when, so on and so on. So you have different sets of words. If you study uno, dos, tres here, and then you take a test on uno, dos, okay, compared to if you restudy or reread, uno means 1, dos means 2. And then you learn something new, like que means what, cuando means when. How would taking a test on something you have learned previously affect your learning of something new? That is the question I wanted to answer. Yeah.
Can I just quickly ask, with respect to the subject, are you talking about if I study chemistry and then I come here and study anatomy, or are they related?
Typically, most of the research that's been done here are about things related to each other.
Okay.
But people have also done studies on things that are completely unrelated to each other. And I'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the time span here? Is this all on the same day?
It's all on the same day.
Okay.
Yes. We're typically talking about things that happen immediately after another. So you can think of it as, let's say, this is one lecture. Okay? And in between the lecture, I insert some questions, okay, into a lecture to break it up. Okay? You can do little breaks. Let's say you're teaching a long class, maybe you feel like students are getting tired, and then you want to break it up by giving them a break. It could be a 5-minute break for a bathroom break. It could be doing something else. Yeah, it could be doing discussions or whatever it is. We have looked at all kinds of other conditions compared to taking the test, and nothing works like taking a test. The test could be very short. It could be a couple of questions, 3 or 4 questions, maybe 2 questions, maybe even 1 question. And I'll talk about all of those things. Okay? So in this particular design, we have subjects learn face name association. You see a face, you need to learn the person's name. Let's say you see a face like this, you need to learn her name's Haley, his name is Caden, her name's Lily. Okay? you're learning a whole bunch of face name pairs. And then after that, in the intervening phase, you either take a test, okay, I show you this face and ask you what's her name. Okay, you need to recall the name, or you're in a restudy condition in which you see the face and you see the intact pair. Okay? That face refers to Lily. So people are split into these two groups, and then they learn something new. Okay? And now let's say they see those faces again, but this time they're learning, what do these people do? What's their profession? And it turns out, for example, this person was a musician. This person was a student. This person was a custodian. And you don't see the name again. Okay? When you learn the profession, you don't see the name again. Okay? So after that, we test them on the new learning. So we ask them, we show them the faces again, and we ask them, what does this person do? And the question is, if you have recalled or retrieved the name of this person previously, her name's Lily, okay, compared to if you have restudied her name by looking at her face with the name intact on it, how would that affect your learning of something new about this person? That she is a custodian. Okay. So it turns out taking a test on something that you have learned previously enhances your ability to learn something new. So people who had taken a practice test on the name of these people learn the profession of these people better than people who just restudy the names of the people. Now, there's some relation here, right? Because the profession and the name are connected to the same person, same face. But that association between name and profession is completely arbitrary, right? The person, I could scramble and take Lily's face, and instead of her being custodian, she could have been a musician. She could be a baseball player. She could be whatever she wants, right? And so that relation here is really arbitrary, and it still shows a powerful effect of testing on the name, on the learning of the profession. And that is a big effect, again. Right? 15% effect is pretty substantial. And we found effects like this time and time again. So people have started doing studies on something similar to this in the 70s, it turns out. So people have done a lot of work on it. So my colleague and I, my colleague Chris Meissner at Iowa State, and my former student, Sarah Davis, she's now assistant professor at University of North Florida. We did a meta-analytic review. We reviewed 150 something studies that we published on the phenomenon, and 84 of those use a design that's pretty similar to the study that I just talked about. Okay? Among these 84 studies that use a similar design, we found an effect size of 0.75. And now what does this effect size mean? It's basically coincidence, and it's expressed in standard deviation unit. So 0.75, if you, let's say you give 100 students a test and you score them, and it turns out, let's say your class shows a distribution that resembles the normal bell curve. A effect size of 0.75 is similar to moving a student up in the ranking by 28 spots out of 100. That's a pretty big effect. Okay? So that's based on 84 studies. That's big sample studies across about 40 years of research. So we know that inserting questions into a learning session can help people remember things they have learned previously. It also enhances their learning of future new stuff. Okay? To address the question earlier that was asked earlier, what if people are studying something, let's say chemistry, they test themselves on chemistry, and then they learn something completely unrelated, something new. Okay? Let's say biology, let's say physics, let's say psychology. And it turns out people have done studies on that too, and it does help even for something completely unrelated. And one of the explanation that has been posed for why this occurs is that when you take a test, some people say resetting of the attentional system. And you can actually see it if you help people up to EEG and you look at the part of the signal, the electrophysiological signal that is associated with attention. Okay? As people start listening to a lecture, Okay, so I've been talking for about 25 minutes now. Okay. I imagine your attention was, you have an easier time focusing on what I want to talk about during the first 5 minutes than during the last 5 minutes. Okay? So if we can track people's attention across time, you will see that their attention will wane across time. And when you ask people to recall something, what happens is that the brain switches mode, and this is called retrieval mode. And you can also see in the brain the signal changes when people try to study something compared to when try to retrieve something. And some people call it resetting the brain. I'm not a fan of that term because I don't know what that means. What does resetting the brain mean? You can't turn it on and turn it back on. But the brain is doing something different. Okay? I don't know exactly what the brain is doing that is different, but it's doing something different. One possibility that I think is pretty simple is that if students are in your class and they're listening to a lecture and they're not paying attention, and then let's say you stop the lecture in the middle, and so at ISU we have a site license to Top Hat, and previously we have Clicker, right? So if you stop the class and you say, everyone answer this question, it won't work the same way if you just pose a question to the entire class and you hope for students to raise their hand to answer questions. 90% of students have no intention of ever answering any of the questions by raising their hands, right? So if you ask them a question that forces them to answer, at the very least, you bring their attention back to the present moment. Okay? And then they can restart the whole process of drifting their attention away. And that temporary rescue of their attention enhances their learning. Okay? So I think of that as having an impact. Another idea is that when you retrieve something, it gives you, when you take a test, it gives you a chance to assess your learning. Many students tend to overestimate their learning. This is called the illusion of competence. I think all of us have seen this, where students come to us and say, I study so hard. How come I got a C, right? It's not just about how hard you study, it's about how you study. And students tend to overestimate their ability to answer questions correctly. When the most popular method for them to study is reread, reread, reread. And it turns out rereading, as I've shown in these data, is a really terrible way to study. When you reread something back to back to back, every time you reread something, it gets faster because you know you can anticipate what word comes up next. And this fluency in processing tends to give us the illusion that we know something. But that's an illusion because you're just using basically your short-term memory. When you take a test, you're relying on long-term memory. Short-term memory does not help you. So it's assessing a different kind of memory, and students will tend to overestimate their performance when they do that. So retrieval practice, whether it be using it during class or encouraging students to do it when they're studying for exam, is a really good method to enhance learning. Yeah, question?
To that point, in the practice tests, were participants seeing their own results?
Do they see their own results? Do they get basically feedback? It doesn't matter whether you give them feedback or not, the effect still happens. But if you want to ensure that to correct their misconceptions or things that they don't remember, it is really important to give feedback. It will not hurt the effect, it will not make the effect bigger. It will just be beneficial to them overall. So now I want to talk about a more recent project. This is with the support of the National Science Foundation, and all the studies that I've talked about were done in the lab. And it's a question whether those data will generalize to sort of real-world situations. So that's what we wanted to do. And my collaborator is Carl Spooner at Toronto Metropolitan University. And for this project, one of the reasons, I think a key reason that we were able to secure the NSF grant is that we say that we want to test half our subjects from community college. And that turned out to be very hard to do. And that's why I am so thankful for ARC for being a collaborator of ours. We have two universities, Toronto Metropolitan University and of course in Toronto, and also ISU, Iowa State University. And we have found collaborating agreements with 6 community colleges in total. There's Iowa Central Community College, Des Moines Area Community College, Mohawk College in the Niagara Falls area, a Cuyahoga Community College in the Cleveland area, Columbus State Community College, and of course ARC. It's bigger. The most important. So what we did was that we used the interpolated testing paradigm that I showed you just now to test students in a more sort of real-world, uncontrolled learning environment. We created these lectures, STEM lectures. We created 4 of them. Each of them is about 20 minutes long. And we break the lectures into 4 equal segments, about 5 minutes each. Okay? And the lectures, some students get randomly assigned to learn something about computer science. Some students get assigned to learn something about animal ecology. Some students learn something about physics. Some learn something about statistics. So they're randomly assigned to 1 or 4 topics. And whatever topic they learn, they will need to watch a 20-minute video lecture, which we break into 4 segments. Okay? So let's say they watch lecture segment 1, 5 minutes long. Right after that, we either show them review slides. Okay? So we show them 4 slides that cover important points from those 5 minutes. 4 slides, each of them, we show them about 30 seconds. Okay? So for a total of 2 minutes. Okay? And the other group of subjects were randomly assigned into a interpolated retrieval practice room. So instead of seeing those 4 review slides, they are asked 4 questions. And they need to come up with the answer, and then we give them the correct answer. Okay? And again, for each question, they get 30 seconds to do it. So it's the amount of time is equivalent. It's only 2 minutes. Okay? And then they watch another lecture segment, and then they took a quiz, or they review, and then they do another lecture segment, and then they took a quiz, or they do a review. And then the last lecture segment is the one that I am most interested in. Okay? For this one, everyone watched the lecture segment, and then everyone took a quiz on it. Okay? So why do I do it like this? The reason why I want to do it like this is I want to know, if you break up a lecture, okay, by asking them questions throughout the lecture, how would that affect the learning of the things that are new? Okay. You have taken the quiz here on lecture segment 3, segment 2, segment 1. How does taking those brief quizzes affect your ability to learn something new compared to if you just read review slides on learning something new? Okay. That's what I wanted to know. It's similar to retrieving the name of a person and then learning the profession for that person. It's the same design, except that this is a lecture. Yeah.
So these are all pre-recorded. It's not an asynchronous. They're not live with the instructor during the content, right?
That's right.
And
Yeah,
then
it's pre-recorded.
Are they sorted in either the quiz group or the review group the whole way through, or are they randomly assigned at each point?
Yes, they're randomly assigned. You either do quizzes
Okay.
or you
So
reset.
you would do like a quiz for the first chunk and then a review for the second one. You're in the same path the whole way. Okay.
That's right. You're in the same path, but they don't know that.
Right.
Okay. So what we tell them is that watch 4 lecture segments, and in between each lecture segment, you either will see review slides or you will see a brief quiz. And the computer randomly determines whether you receive quiz or review slides after each segment. So you could take no quizzes at all. You could take 1 quiz. You could take 3 quizzes. You could take 4 quizzes. It's a random algorithm, but it's actually not random. So they either do all quizzes or they restudy 3 times and take a quiz. Okay. So, and then on top of that, 24 to 36 hours later, they all get an email. They're reminded, hey, I want you to take 1 more test. This is the cumulative test, and we're going to ask you questions that cover the entire lecture, all 4 segments of it. Okay. So we have 2 tests for each subject, and why do I want to do this? It's because, like I said before, all the studies that I've told you before were done in the lab, almost all of them. And the only ones that were done online were done with Amazon Mechanical Turk subjects. So these are people who volunteer to do their studies for, like, say, 15-minute study to earn like $3. And I don't know how representative those data are. There have been studies that have looked into Amtrak data and whether they resample data that you'll get in the lab. And sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. We wanted to do this study in the real world with real students who are in colleges and who are university taking these classes. The lab is a great, wonderful environment to study something scientifically. We have perfect control, mostly perfect control, right? We have students coming into the lab, we tell them, turn off your cell phone, or turn it to silence, put it away. You sit here, the computers are on lockdown, you can't browse the web, you can't do other things, you can't answer, your instant messaging, you can't check your TikTok or whatever, right? And you sit there, and that's all you do for the next half an hour or so. But that's not how online learning works, right? In this very realistic stock photo, you see the students using a laptop, and she has a phone, right? And so the laptop is not enough. We also have a phone. And maybe we even have a tablet, okay? And that's not even taking into account our roommates, family members, our dog, our cats, jumping onto the keyboard, whatever it might be. Real world is messy. Do the findings that we found in the lab, do they translate to real world online learning when it's uncontrolled, okay? For real students. So let me show you a 10-second clip of the lecture video that we showed. It's very brief. Okay, so they have space here on the bottom where they can take notes. We tell them to take notes, as much notes as they want, and here's what the lecture kind of looked like.
Welcome to today's lecture on computer science and programming. From today's class, you will learn the basics of computation using a mechanical device.
Okay, something like that, and it goes on for 20 minutes. And we make sure that it's not super engaging. We hire actors, and we tell them, you make it boring. Okay? Don't animate too much. Just occasionally, you can occasionally raise your hand and point at things. But most of the time, just talk to the camera. Just make it boring, because we want people to get disengaged. So this is a pretty large-scale study. With the help of NSF, we pay each participant $20 to do the study. And thank goodness for community colleges like ARC, we were able to get a pretty diverse sample. So with 59% women, self-identified women subjects, 34% men, 5% non-binary, and 2% declined not to answer. And then when it comes to race, about 10% of them were African American, 10% Asian or Asian Americans, and so on. You can see the statistics here. I also looked at the data for just Iowa State. Iowa is a very white state, and Iowa State is a very white college. 85% of our subjects were white, and about 10% were Asians, and basically almost no diversity. For ARC, we get much greater diversity. In fact, there's a majority-minority or minority-majority. Majority-minority. So 47% of the students in our sample from ARC, about 90 participants, were white, and the rest of them were all different types of races. So this is probably one of the better data sets that is out there, and we had a lot of students. So overall, the overall sample had 700 participants in it. About 360 of them are from the two universities, ISU and Toronto Metropolitan, and then about 330 students are from the 6 community colleges that we work with. So the overall effect, when you combine the university and community college students, and by the way, to my knowledge, no studies in this literature have reported data from community colleges. None. So this is the first set of data that have community college students in a substantial number. So overall, there's an effect. Taking those interpolated quizzes enhances people's learning in that last segment of the lecture by about 7%. Now you see, this data, you might feel like it's slightly underwhelming compared to those giant effects that I showed you. I mean, that's the difference between real world and the lab, right? We get these 15%, 20% effects in the lab, and they shrunk down to about 7%. But it's still a significant effect. It's about half a letter grade. That's pretty good. Okay? Then now, if I break down the data by university and community college, take a look at university, this is the data, and community college, essentially the same pattern. Love seeing that, right? And now, you might be curious, well, what about ARC? Okay. I'm going to replace those bars on the right-hand side with ARC data, and they look like this. So, right in the middle. And so ARC students get benefited the same way as university students, as the other community college students. It's a pretty universal effect. The improvement on their learning, new learning, based on those interpreted quizzes enhances performance for everybody. I also took a look, quick look this morning to look at the racial breakdowns to see if the effect can enhance learning for all the different races, and the answer is yes. And then let's take a look at the performance a day to a day and a half later on that cumulative test that covers everything. What does taking those interpolated quizzes do to your memory retention a day later? And here, the effects, again, look just like the last slide. So not only does it benefit people taking quizzes inside a class, not only does it benefit people's learning during the class, it also enhances their memory a day to two later. Okay? So these are great effects, and again, I'm going to show you the data for ARC. It looks something similar to the rest of the community college. The effect is a little bit smaller, but it's there. So what I've answered now, this question, is that testing enhances real-world performance as well, even in completely uncontrolled environments. Now, when it comes to thinking about testing, so far I've presented you with data on testing as an intervention. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about testing as an assessment, especially online assessment. And I think all of us are probably thinking about, sort of the elephant in the room being ChatGPT or Bard or whatever new AI chatbots will come up. And the data I'm going to show you on this is not about ChatGPT, but it is about online assessment. So I think all of us who ever teach online classes care about the question of, are online assessments accurate? Do they tell us how much students have learned when you give students a test online? Okay. So let's think about it this way. Think about in-person exams compared to online exams. In-person exams, typically what we want an exam to do is to be able to diagnose learning. Okay? What I mean by diagnose is that if a person studies really hard and knows the stuff, that person should get an A on the exam. Okay? The test should tell you that someone who has learned a lot will score better than someone who does not, have not learned a lot. Okay? That's my emoji, by the way, my face. So, and if a test can tell you accurately someone who knows a lot compared to someone who has not known much or has not studied much, if we call it a test, we call that the test diagnostic. It's basically the gold standard in assessment. Right? In-person exams is gold standard assessment because we don't really have better practical methods to assess learning other than in-person exams. That's the best way to do it. That's how high-stake exams are done, right, in person. The question is, what does online exams do? And researchers have sort of looked into this. So they compare in-person exam performance to online exam performance. But a lot of the studies that have been done were based on observational data. And so what they essentially do is that instead of comparing in-person exams to online exams, they're comparing people who take in-person classes to people who take online classes. Okay? Now, what is that problem? Why is this a problem? It's a problem because of four things. People who take in-person exams, take in-person classes and online classes, they're typically different courses. Okay? A course that's offered online may not be offered in person. If you're taking a lab class, right, there's a lot of lab components, you can't really do it online. Okay? So that's a different course. They have different instructors, right? We have all had really good instructors before. We've also had some not so good instructors before. The instructor can have a powerful impact on students' learning. They might be different schools. For example, ARC, I know that 60% of the courses now are online, right? Whereas like school like Iowa State, 90% of the courses are in person. So, and also the key, I think the most important thing is that they are different students. When you just compare students who take courses in person versus those online, they are very different students. A lot of students who take courses in person, they're full-time enrolled students, right? That's very different from the group that tends to take most of their courses online. So when you compare that, and another issue with these studies that have been done in the past is that they look at in-person course exam performance, online course exam performance. Sometimes they find that the online course students do worse than the in-person course, and then they say, oh, online learning is not as good as in-person learning. But then when they find that online exam performance is higher than in-person exam performance, then they say it's because people cheat. Okay? So they want to have their lunch and also eat it. And the biggest problem here is that when you compare the average test scores for online exams and in-person exams, it doesn't tell you much. Let's say you find that for an online exam, even for the same course, online exam, the average score is 75%. In-person exam score, 65%. So online exam score is 10% higher. Some people say that's cheating. Okay? But who cares if they score 10% higher in general? Okay? There are ways to address that. Pretty easy ways. You could adjust the grade cutoff. You could make the questions harder. If you do multiple choice, instead of giving 4 choices, you give 6 choices. You give 7 choices. There are many ways to address an overall difference. What we should care about, what we should look at, is not average score differences. What we need to look at is individual scores. If, for example, let's say I am a bad student and I don't study very hard, and on average, if I take an in-person exam, I get 50%. What is my score when I take an exam online? Compared to, let's say, Yuj here, he's a really good student, he studies really hard. On in-person exam, he gets 90%. What is his score on the online exams compared to the in-person exam? And so I'm thinking about this in terms of a correlation, not average score differences. We need to look at, for individual persons, what is the correspondence between their in-person exam score and online exam scores? Let's say I have an individual here, and this person scores about 75% on an in-person exam. Where is this person on online exam? Let's say she scores 90%, 95%. For another person, okay, so we need to look at correspondence. For another person, if they score, let's say, 25% on the in-person exam, what would their score be like on the online exams? If that person, let's say, if you believe in some people say everyone cheats on online exams, everyone cheats. They think that everyone cheats. Then you expect scores to look like this. Doesn't matter how well you score on the in-person exams, doesn't matter how well you have studied or learned, you're just going to score really good. You have no heterogeneity in your data. Everyone just score really good. On the other hand, it's possible that the data will look like this. If the data looks like this, then it means online assessment provides information that's similar to in-person assessment, despite the possibility of cheating, right? But the problem is it's hard to do a study like this. You need students to take both online exams and in-person exam in the same course with the same instructors, right? When are you going to be able to do that? It turns out there's one semester universally in which this happened. Spring 2020, right? That fateful day, fateful semester, where before spring break, everyone was taking their classes in person. After spring break, everybody took their class online. Same course, same instructor, different types of exams for the same course. So, with my graduate student, we asked instructors at our university, at ISU, to provide their data for us. And we reached out to the entire university. We were able to secure data from 18 different courses, spanning from 100 level to 400 level courses, courses in liberal arts, art history, engineering, biology, chemistry, psychology, you name it. Overall, the data set contains data from about 2,000 students. And what did we find? We looked at their in-person exam scores in that first half of the semester compared to the online scores in the second half of the semester. The data looked like this. So, online assessment provides good assessment accuracy if you compare that to in-person exams. And these online exams, none of them use online proctoring. Okay? There's no lockdown browser, there's no online surveillance, right? None of that. Okay? And if we break the data down by individual courses, the same pattern appear in every single course. Okay? Every one of these figures shows a diagonal line going up. That means there's a positive correlation between people's in-person exam scores and online exam scores. Beautiful data, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about modality of assessment. Are these all multiple choice exams?
These are not all multiple choice exams. And although many instructors move to exclusively multiple choice exams for online, because it's so much harder to grade in-person exams. Also, that semester, everyone is just losing their minds already, right? I know that there are some professors who say, I'm going to make the exam harder and use only essay questions. But that's pretty rare. The shift is much more likely to be going to multiple choice exams than the other way around.
I see.
Yeah. And that's producing these data despite the fact that they're moving to the easier tests. Okay. So I want to end the talk here by saying that what I've shown you today is that retrieval practice or testing can serve as both as a form of assessment, but also an intervention. It's great for learning, for students learning, both helping them staying focused in class and for long-term retention. And also, at least up to 2020, okay, online exams, even unproctored, are diagnostic of learning. Now, how does AI change that? We don't know yet. I'm not jumping to conclusion. It's not like people didn't have any way to cheat in 2020. It wasn't hard if they wanted to cheat, right? So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. I know we are a little bit over time, but if anyone has a couple of questions, I think, yeah.
What are you looking at next?
So after we published that paper on the online assessment stuff, somebody in University of Swansea wrote a hit piece to the editor and say that, well, because their online, overall the online average test people score like 6% higher than in-person exams. Therefore, online exams are not a good form of assessment. Every test should be done in person. And I thought, do you live in the real world? Like, there are online classes, there are online degrees. Are you going to bring the students into campus to make them take the test if they're taking a course online? So of course that doesn't make sense to me. And also, when we wrote a reply and published that reply, our title was Missing the Forest for the Trees. The person's focusing on exactly what I say not to focus on, which is average score. And I say, you need to look at the correlation. That's what's important. And people like him are jumping to conclusion. They say, so there are people that have looked at, okay, can ChatGPT pass exams? And the answer is yes, ChatGPT can pass exams. They can, if you just put questions into ChatGPT, people will get a B, okay, or B minus, or something like that. Depending on the version of ChatGPT, the newer versions are better. And they say, because ChatGPT can pass exams, therefore we should not give online exams anymore. That's a leap in logic in my mind. And we wanted to do experimental studies on cheating. And there have been very few experimental studies on cheating. And the ones that have been done are not the way I would do it. So we want to do a study where we tell people to cheat. And then I want to know if you tell them to cheat, to the students who are good students compared to the not as good students, do the good students perform better than the not as good students if they both cheat, right? We don't have an answer to that question yet, but people are jumping to conclusion. And I would believe smart students will cheat better than the non-smart students. So if that's the case, then we'll still see a good correlation. But nobody knows the answer to that question. But that's what we plan to do.
With respect to your practice test, one thing you mentioned early on about fill in the blank. Is it better fill in the blank or multiple choice?
It is
Does that
better
make
to
any
fill in the
difference?
blank.
Okay.
If you can do fill in the blanks, you should use
I
fill in the
mean,
blanks.
it's more work for me, but I find a better result.
It is better. Yeah. But multiple choice also works, just not as well.
Thinking about like the environmental effects of learning and retention and recall, how would the relationship a student has with their instructor affect their ability to remember and then later recall information?
I don't know the answer to that question.
So
But-
thinking about the on-ground versus online,
Mhm.
the context of that learning, right? Like if you have a connection, a personal connection with your instructor, for example, right?
Mhm.
Which can totally be done online, but right. Yeah, I'm wondering how that influences this process for individual students.
Yeah, definitely that has not been a topic of investigation. I would think that the more engaged a student is with the environment in which they learn, the better the result will be.
That'd be my hypothesis.
And the way I sort of extrapolate that is based on in-lab, right? In-lab, the effects are bigger because, well, they have nothing else to do. They're just focusing to an extent on the experiment. Whereas when they do the experiment online, they're doing all kinds of other things. And anytime you have a less controlled environment, it's just going to increase noise in your data and you just water down the effect. That's the way I think about it.
I'm wondering though if there's an affective element to that process where if I'm a student and I really care about doing well in this assessment because I care about the feedback I get from the instructor maybe, or I feel supported by that instructor in the process, rather than being this like adversarial, like they're out to get me kind of approach, like how that affects their ability to recall, short and long term.
Yeah, so one thing that I do when I implement questions in class is that I make those questions bonus questions. So students at least don't feel like I'm trying to test them all the time and evaluate them all the time. Rather, I explain to them that this is the way to help you learn. And students typically tend to appreciate that. When it comes to the relationship between a student and the instructor, like I said, I don't know the answer to that question. But one good thing is that when I look at the data across race, for example, there's achievement gaps across race. But practically every race showed the effect. And the students who, in the review condition that tend to do worse, tend to benefit more from these types of interventions.
What about, you talked a little bit about the racial and gender representation. What about students with disabilities? Has that been
Unfortunately, I
studied?
don't have data on that. We didn't, excuse me, we actually didn't even ask about disabilities in our demographic questionnaire, and I don't know of any data that have looked into it either.
And then I was also curious about the tests that you had them complete, like the more comprehensive. Are those timed? And have they ever been done untimed? And how that might affect as well?
So on that cumulative test, they can take as long as they want. But most students don't take that long. After all, this is not a high stakes situation. And on the studies that have looked at timed tests versus untimed tests, there is no difference in the magnitude of the effect. There have been very few studies that have looked at that though. 3 off the top of my head. 2 of them mine.
Thank you.
With respect to the retrieval practice, you're assuming there is something in memory. So my question is, are there simple techniques we can do to help the students go from short-term memory to long-term memory, so there's substantial stuff there to retrieve? Now I think about, a lot of complicated things, all the chemistry things, all the anatomy, and is there any way to help that?
The key is to test themselves as soon as possible.
Okay.
Test early and test often.
Is that self-testing, or maybe encouraging self-testing, or? actually doing it as part of the class?
You can do it either way.
Okay.
Yeah, so test early and test often is sort of the thing that I tell students is similar to, so if you think about memory, right after you hear something, okay, your memory for that thing is the best. So about, what I talked about today, right after you leave the room, your memory for this thing will be the best. And over time, you start forgetting. And if you take a test, it gives you a boost and slows down that forgetting. I think of it as kind of like staying in shape is easier than getting in shape, right? So if you maintain a high level of memory by retrieving information soon after you learn that information, you have a lot more to retrieve, a lot more to benefit your memory from that retrieval than if you wait a couple of days before you start, trying to test yourself. It's going to be a lot less helpful.
Great. Thank you again, everyone, for attending.
Thank
you.
And Jen, ask a question?
I miss having research conversations. That's nice. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.